European Union and human rights. There is a wide debate about the extent of the European Union's commitment to human rights principles, specifically regarding the issue of refugees and migrants, and I consider it unfair to generalize one opinion on this important issue, as it is possible to diagnose many and different positions from within the Union, at the official and popular levels. On the official level, we will find that many countries have opened their doors to refugees, have received them well, and have provided them with decent conditions of residence, Germany, Sweden, and others, while other countries have closed their borders to refugees, and have refrained from receiving them, especially border countries such as Greece and Italy, while they are stricter. Other governments are against migrants and refugees, such as Poland, Hungary, and Austria. On the grassroots level, we have seen the people and civil institutions improve the reception of refugees, provide them with aid, and donate them with relief materials, in exchange for cases of racial intolerance and violent hate crimes in many countries of the Union, such as beating, assaulting veiled women, although these cases are limited, but they are increasing. Many European countries, Sweden, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Denmark, Germany, etc., after the refugees arrive on their lands, give each family a home with full furniture and a salary, and start with them a policy of integration, which includes learning the language, European culture, work insurance, and enrollment in schools. In the Netherlands, for example, the family is asked to watch films that include pornographic scenes, as a step toward accepting the country's culture. However, many reports revealed cases of human rights violations in a number of countries of the Union, and these violations begin before the arrival of refugees, where press reports monitored cases of deliberate dumping of refugee ships at sea, especially near Italy and Malta, or the delay and slowdown in their rescue, and these reports estimate the numbers tens of thousands of refugees have been drowned in the Mediterranean. In 2017, the proportion of deceased immigrants reached 1 in 18. In a very strange situation, 5 countries, Finland, France, Germany, Luxembourg, and Portugal, agreed to receive specific numbers of immigrant children stranded in Greece, provided that the children alone were not accompanied by a parent, or in very poor health status. In some ways, this means exploiting the poor conditions of the families and kidnapping their children from them. Other reports also revealed the poor conditions of refugees in most of the countries of the Union, where the policies of those countries require that they be placed in closed camps for long periods, which may extend for years, before fulfilling the conditions of accepting their integration into society and granting them permanent residence. In those camps, refugees live in degrading conditions, cruel, and inhumane. Some refugees, in Italy, for example, are forced to work on farms, receive low salaries, and dozens of them accumulate in vile huts, under unsanitary conditions, and not worthy of human beings, in a manner similar to slavery, amid the government's neglect and negligence of their conditions, or their collusion with their operators, the matter that gives the impression that the European Union's talk of human rights is just propaganda. Those policies and practices are rejected and condemned, and reveal the falsehood of European slogans related to human rights, or their selectivity and fragility, but, before condemning Europe, let us remember the following data. The tragedy of refugees has already started in their countries, in Syria, which is the largest source of refugees. The regime and armed opposition groups share the responsibility of the tragedy of the Syrian people, which has pushed millions of them to emigrate, and in many countries in Africa and Asia, especially Afghanistan, the corrupt and authoritarian governments bear the responsibility for the deteriorating conditions of their countries, so much so that it pushed people to flee that hell to delusional paradise. Before the refugees reach the borders of Europe, human trafficking gangs and smuggling brokers conspire against them, sell them delusion, and expose their lives to grave dangers. Upon their arrival in North African countries, especially Libya, they are subjected to severe repression, and are held in prison-like facilities, in extremely humiliating and cruel conditions. In Turkey, many reports deal with terrible violations against refugees, especially Syrians, where the regime uses them as a pressure card and bargaining with Europe, and sacrifices them as scapegoats for political purposes. While poor Arab countries received huge numbers of refugees, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria received millions of Iraqis before the crisis, the rich countries, especially the Gulf states, refrained from receiving even a single refugee. With regard to racism, Islamophobia, and violence against immigrants in Europe, let us remember the terrorist operations that claimed the lives of civilians in a number of European cities, which offended the image of the refugee, and even the image of Islam itself, as well as the systematic practices of some Islamic movements, which established their own regions, and began calling for war on what they called the Crusaders and the Infidels, or by trying to impose its puritanical ideology on the European societies that live in the middle of it, which raised concern Europeans for their future, and for the secular lifestyles they chose for themselves. Before that, let us remember that Arab societies are among the most practicing racist societies in the world, and that racism is not limited to strangers, foreigners, and blacks, but rather includes racism among the same people, and we find it at the official level through residency laws, and on the popular level in many forms. Not only is it racism, but rather the double standards. For example, we condemn the practices of European countries towards Muslims, under the pretext of Islamophobia, and we condemn their policies in preventing the call to prayer, or in the impossible conditions for building mosques, but let us remember our view of other sects and religions, and remember that building a new church in most Arab countries, it is close to impossible, and if we do, we will find popular protests that sometimes lead to violence. And if the European countries set difficult and arduous conditions before granting the refugee the right to residency or citizenship, most Arab countries put more difficult conditions towards their residents of other Arab nationalities, or even just to cross their lands. There is no doubt that the refugees live in great distress, and are subjected to a real tragedy, and that tragedy we all bear responsibility for, and we will pay a high price for it in the future. It is true that their rights were violated in their homelands, but that does not justify their violation in Europe and elsewhere, and does not absolve Europeans of their responsibilities. For your tongue does not mention one's own nakedness, for all are nakedness, and men have tongues.